We are going to talk about the deadly sin of pride. So go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 20, verses 45 through 47. Luke chapter 20, verses 45 through 47. C.S. Lewis, in his book called Mere Christianity, called pride the essential vice and the utmost evil. As a matter of fact, he said that pride is the absolute, complete anti-God state of mind. As a matter of fact, we'll look here in a little bit and we'll notice that every sin in some way seems to go back to pride. Pride's a root of many, many sins. Now let's look at our passage. Looking here in Luke chapter 20, beginning of verse 45, it says, Then in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, Beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at the feast. And yet they devour widows' houses, and for a pretense they make long prayers. And he says they're going to receive a greater condemnation. Tonight, as we talk about pride, I want us to humbly examine ourselves and look at ourselves and make sure that pride does not exist within us, that we are a humble people before God. So let's talk about pride. What is the nature of pride? Well, pride, most simply, is thinking more highly of yourself than you should. But it's deeper than that. It's actually an inordinate self-esteem that's rooted in self-love. In other words, you're so in love with yourself and you have become so much the center of your own universe that you don't care about anybody else. You don't treat other people well. And that sense of pride, that sense of inward selfishness creates an avenue, a road for many more prayers. And that's where the issue comes from. So that's what pride is. Now, well, here's some things pride isn't. Pride is not self-respect. Sometimes people are like, you got to be so humble to where you are completely selfless. But it's important for Christians, for everybody, to have self-respect. Self-respect is not thinking of yourself as being better than others, but it's an integrity that exists within you where you love yourself and you appreciate yourself enough because of who you are. Because God sent His Son to die for you, because you're God's holy temple, there's a level of self-respect. And that self-respect gives you the integrity that you need in order to be a Christian, in order to make good decisions. One of the reasons why you stay away from sin, one of the reasons why you watch what you eat and make sure that you exercise every day and take care of your body, one of the reasons why you put yourself in good relationships is because you have a level of self-respect. Now, that's not pride. That's something you do need. Pride is not self-esteem. Self-esteem, what I mean by that is having a proper judgment of yourself. Romans chapter 12 and verse 3 tells us that, each one of us should esteem ourselves in the correct way. Now, self-esteem will rise and fall with the quality of life, but Christians have to understand it's okay to be happy. It's okay to appreciate life and enjoy the life and the blessing God's given us here on this earth. Pride is not self-love. Self-love is a good thing. As a matter of fact, Jesus uses it as a platform to show us how to love others. In Matthew chapter 22 and verse 39, he says, you should love other people as you love yourself. In Ephesians chapter 5, he says, husbands, love your wives as you love your own body. Love your wives as you love yourself. Nurture your wives. Cherish your wives. Appreciate your wives. Sinful pride is not being proud. It's okay for Christians to be proud. I'm proud of all my children. I'm proud of some of the accomplishments which I've had in life. I'm proud oftentimes of the good things we have going on at church. That's not a sinful thing. It's okay to be proud. But it is a sin to be prideful. So what do we mean when we talk about sinful pride? What is it we're talking about? Well, sinful pride is the elevation of ourself over other people. It's the elevation or rising above other folks. As a matter of fact, even in our language, you see when we talk about pride, we're talking about elevation, pulling something up. Somebody's on their high horse, or somebody's looking down their nose at me, or somebody is stuck up, or somebody lives in their ivory tower. See how all those are talking about the height and looking down? And many times we use those figures of speech because that's what pride is looking down on other people. And pride oftentimes is talked about as far as being a largesse of a person. Here's what I mean by that. Somebody is puffed up. Somebody is full of themselves. Somebody is inflated. They have an inflated sense of pride. What is pride? What is sinful pride? It's the disregarding of other people. It's the hating of boundaries and constraints. It's the desire to lay hold of your own glory. And think back with me in Daniel chapter 4 when we think about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar stood at the city wall and he looked at the hanging gardens and he looked at his empire and he said, all these things I have created. He's looking down. He's puffed up. It's all about self-love. And when that happened, God brought him down. God humbled him until he repented. William Mary, an old preacher from centuries ago, has a quote, and that is, pride is a sin of the first person singular. A person who's full in pride, he can't have fellowship with other people. Think, for example, the Pharisees in the New Testament. They had to pray more than everybody else to show they were more spiritual. They had to fast more often than everybody else. They had to suffer more. They had to dress differently than everybody else. They had to be more of an expert, and they had to know more than everybody else. Their pride would not allow them to have fellowship, to have friendship, to community with the people who are around. And that, as we'll look here later, we'll notice, is one of the biggest dangers of pride. It separates us from the people we love and the people we need to be around. Now, there's many varieties of pride, if you will. Varieties which are there. The first variety is vanity. The idea of vanity is a preoccupation with your appearance, the preoccupation with other people's opinions of you. And this idea of having to look a certain way to everybody who's around. Now, that's a danger. It's a danger when you suffer from vanity because suddenly your character depends on what other people think. And suddenly you have to live according to everybody else's approval. A lot of people are in huge debt because they have to have stuff to show off to everybody else. There's a lot of people who are carried off into sin because their friends are all sinning. Other people around them are sinning. And because of that, because of their vanity, they have to fit in and they have to be equal to everyone else who's around them. Now, a second form of pride would be conceit. Conceit's different than vanity because conceit is an exaggerated sense of superiority that a person would have. They have to be preeminent all the time. This may be a silly illustration. I have a couple puppy dogs around my house, and one of them, he's a weenie dog, and the dog is very conceited. Every time you're at a certain place, he has to be the one at your feet. When somebody's going out or coming in, he has to be the first one to go out. He's the first one at the dinner bowl. He always has to be first because, dogs, as being a community animal, pack animal, they always are trying to figure out who's the alpha animal. Well, my dog Jasmine wants to be the alpha, and so there's that preeminence. You ever noticed how some people are always searching after preeminence? In Luke chapter 18 and verse 11, we see the parable of Jesus, of the Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple. And Jesus tells us that the Pharisee is there praying. As he's there praying, he begins to have to be the dominant alpha person. And he says, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like, this person over here. I fast correctly. I pray together. I'm not a sinner. And his whole religion was on being conceited, showing that he was better than this person or that person or whatever else it might be. And Paul addresses the same thing over in 1 Corinthians 4:6 when he's talking about a church which is splitting up into so many factions because everybody is jealous of each other. And he says, don't you realize the gifts that you have are given to you? You didn't earn these things. God placed you in this situation. Don't be filled with conceit. Now, the third form of pride I want us to discuss tonight, we talked about vanity, we talked about conceit, it's arrogance. And arrogance is the most dangerous one. Arrogance, I think, is worse than the other two because vanity needs admirers, conceit needs inferiors, somebody to be below you. Arrogance doesn't need anybody. And this person is somebody who feels like they are better than everybody else. The danger here is an arrogant person is going to use people. He's going to abuse people according to his own purpose. He's just going to see people as property or as pieces of a chessboard, and his arrogance causes him to not see people as the creation of God, but instead as objects to be used. Now, where is pride seen, especially in Christians? And that's what I want us to talk about here real quickly. If I have pride in my life, you have pride in your life, how is it seen? First and foremost, it's seen in the treatment that you have of other people. How do you treat your neighbor? Is there an arrogant attitude in which you place people underneath you as far as that conceit, or you place people and you have to look better than them as far as you would in vanity? Do you use people? Do you love your neighbor? Do you love your enemy? Many times we won't treat our enemy very well because of pride. The Pharisee, the priest and the Levite passed by the Good Samaritan, wouldn't take care of them. Much of that's because of pride, which is there. And when you and I don't treat other people the way we should, usually the problem is rooted in our hearts. Our pride's not in the right place. Pride is seen in the Christian today in our mortality. Do you recognize that the end will come? James chapter 4 and verse 13 talks about how many people are prideful and they make plans for today and tomorrow, and they make plans for this trip and that trip, and they don't realize that our life is nothing more than a vapor. So often we go through life and we never respect and we never expect it to come to an end. And therefore we don't take opportunities that God has given us. Number 3, pride shows up sometimes in our doctrine. You know, sometimes, even though we read our Bibles, even though we're checking out what's in this scripture, we have a confirmation bias. We find verses that confirm what we're thinking, that confirm what we want it to say. When's the last time you're convicted? When's the last time you read through a verse or heard a sermon and you realize, I'm wrong. I have a wrong opinion about that, or I need to change something with this. There's 3 places in which pride is usually shown within a Christian. The way we treat others, whether or not we see our own mortality, and our doctrine as well. So let's get ready to close up in talking about consequences of pride. Now, that's a little misleading because we're probably about halfway through the lesson, but I thought I'd say it just to get everybody excited. Consequences. First and foremost, avoid pride because it leads to calamity. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 18, one of the more popular passages. Pride leads to destruction. A haughty spirit leads before a fall. We already looked at Daniel chapter 4, 30 through 33, talking about Nebuchadnezzar and how God brought this great king down to a point of insanity. Remember the book of Esther? You got Haman. And Haman had planned out this way of, because of his arrogance and conceit, and he was going to destroy this man named Mordecai. And yet, as he built those huge gallows, it ended up being Haman who died at Haman's gallows. His pride destroyed him in a roundabout way. Sennacherib went against Jerusalem, and he taunted Jerusalem about how their God could not defend them, and they needed to surrender and begin worshiping his God. And the very next night, his own sons put him to death. His end came because of his pride. In Acts chapter 12, we see where Herod is speaking to the people, and the people trying to get a tax break begin to call him a god and begin talking about how impressive he is. And because of that, he was struck down. And we're told in the Bible that worms ate his belly. He died in the most grotesque and painful way possible. Each time, pride led to calamity. And when you and I are filled with pride, we are in great danger. Proverbs 23 talks about how God places the proud on a slippery slope. And even at their greatest height, they will fall. Now, it's not always God striking people down when they have pride. Usually, it's we ourselves who destroy ourselves with our pride. Pride brings a fall because we've overestimated ourselves. We assume that we're better than we are. We're more able than we are. We assume that we're more intelligent or that we're superior. And by doing so, many times we bring many thorns into our life. Smart people do dumb things when they have lots of pride. Smart people don't listen to the limits which are there. And it brings great trouble. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 15, the wise are cautious and turn from evil, but the fool is the one who throws off restraint and is absolutely careless. So pride leads to calamity. Secondly, pride leads to self-content. And when that happens, eventually there will be self-pity. Now that's paradox. When you're prideful, you're eventually going to be depressed. You're going to be low. Now that doesn't seem to make sense, but it does. Why? Because pride leads us to an improper view of ourselves. When we place ourselves above other people, eventually we're going to be brought down. And there's that self-pity. When we think we're smarter, when we think we're better, eventually we're going to be put in our place, and then we're going to see it. We always think we're better than we are, but then reality comes and it spoils the fantasy that's there. Number 3, pride. As we mentioned earlier, it undermines community. 1 Corinthians 12:25 tells us that we should care for one another and take care of one another. But the proud person is too self-absorbed with himself to care about anybody else. He's too competitive. He is too quarrelsome because he always has to have his way. And because of that, when we're prideful, we end up by ourselves. We end up alone. A lot of marriages are destroyed because of pride. A lot of times we have trouble keeping our job, our occupation, because of pride. A lot of times we have trouble in the Lord's church because of pride. It undermines so many things. The church in Corinth wrestled with cliques. Some were following Apollos and some were following Cephas, and it was going back and forth. The church was breaking apart because of pride, because everybody was trying to be above everyone else. The apostles themselves in Mark chapter 10, 35 through 41. They came to Jesus and they said, which one of us is most important? I want to be on your left side. I want to be your right side. And it ended up, in a sense, breaking up the people until Jesus was able to fix the situation and remind them they were all servants and that they would all be blessed by God. Pride causes us to hate authority. In Numbers chapter 12, you see where the siblings of Moses, Aaron and also his sister Miriam, came to Moses and they said, why does the Lord only speak through you? The Lord should speak through us as well. And when that happened, they hated authority. God judged them. Miriam had leprosy. Aaron was forced out of his job for a little bit. There was a great deal of trouble there because of their pride. They didn't like authority. 2 chapters later, Numbers chapter 16, 250 leaders, Korah and others, came before Moses and they said, the Lord shouldn't just speak through you. The Lord should speak through us as well. And the earth opened up and swallowed them. They hated authority. Many times when you and I have an issue with someone's authority, many times when you and I have an issue with conflict, take a step back because it might be pride. And that might be the issue that's there. Worst of all of these, number 5, pride will alienate us from God. You see, it's the worship of the creature rather than the creator. It's a worship of self. Pride makes us feel sufficient. It makes us think that we can take care of ourselves and that we don't need God any longer. Notice Satan came up to Eve and said, if you take of this fruit, you'll be as smart as God. You'll be as the gods. You'll be gods, is what he said. Getting to that pride, that self-sufficiency which was there. In Matthew chapter 4, Satan came up to Jesus. And he said, if you'll worship me, I will give you every kingdom of the world. And the Lord rejected him because he knew he was sufficient. That he was not sufficient without God. He needed to follow God's plan. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, don't love the world or the things of the world, the things of this world, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. Are not of the kingdom, but they're of the world, and they will soon pass away. C.S. Lewis puts it this way. In God, you meet someone who is greater in every regard insurmountably, who is in every regard insurmountably superior to yourself. If you don't see God in that way, then you don't really know God. If God is your co-pilot, you're in the wrong plane. Because God is in charge. He's smarter than we are. He's greater than we are. He's more experienced than we are. He's more important than we are. We must humble ourselves, and he will lift us up. And so we talked about how bad pride is. But what do we do? If we find pride, how do you get pride out of the heart? Well, you have to cultivate humility. How do you cultivate humility? It's painful. And it takes a lot of work. And really, in a lot of senses, you're never done. First thing you need to do is rigorous self-examination. Don't rationalize. Don't have self-flattery. Sometimes we say, well, I sin in this way, but it's not a big sin. Well, it's a big sin. Or, I'm such a good person. I deserve. No. There needs to be a rigorous self-examination. You need to honestly look at your heart, honestly look at what you do, and then rip the pride out of there. Secondly, when we're cultivating humility, confession. Confess to God. Pray for Him to take away your pride at least every day. James chapter 5, verse 16 tells us the importance of confessing to other people. Find a good mentor. Find someone you can trust. Open up. Make sure that they're not going to abuse you in any way. But when we verbalize our pride, when we verbalize these things, it makes us better. Number 3, regard criticisms. Now, none of us like having an enemy. But let me tell you something. Having an enemy may be one of the best things in the world that you have. Because when you have an enemy, that person is not worried about hurting your feelings when he tells you what you're doing wrong. When you have an enemy, that person's not going to be overly polite and not bring something up. And so when you have an enemy who is bringing things against you, realize many times they'll exaggerate those things. Sometimes maybe they'll even fabricate those things. But listen to people who complain, because oftentimes there is a root of truth that's there. And that's something we should listen to. Number 4, focus on your character. When you are working on self-improvement, focus on your character rather than your socially desirable traits. Some people are really worried about what they look like. Some people really focus upon how smart they are, or how rich they are, or how successful they are, and all those things are good. But if we are to rid ourselves of pride, it goes back to character. Who I am does not depend upon my looks. Who I am does not depend on my intelligence or college degrees or attainments in this world. Who I am does not depend on what's in my bank account. Who I am truly depends on my character. How I act when life does not go well. How I act towards those who can't respond in kind. Am I nice to people who can't repay me? Who am I in the dark when nobody else sees me but God? Now, as we've looked at this lesson, there's a deadly sin of pride. And Jesus points out the scribes and the Pharisees in our passage in which we're looking at here in Luke chapter 20. These people looked religious. These people were honored by everybody who was around. And yet when Jesus saw them, he saw their hearts and he saw their shortcomings and realized they needed to come back to God. Let's be sure as we examine ourselves, we understand the nature of pride and how dangerous it is. Let's be sure that we don't fall to vanity, that we don't fall to conceit, we don't fall to arrogance. But instead, we treat other people well. We understand that we're on this world for just a short time. And we make sure our doctrine is right. Let's keep away from the consequences of pride and be sure that we create within our hearts a spirit of humility. Thank you very much for the time in which